There are certain cities in the United States that seem to exist in a delicate balance between motion and silence, where the daylight hours are filled with the predictable rhythm of ordinary life, with people moving through their routines, speaking to one another in familiar tones, and believing, perhaps without ever consciously realizing it, that the structure of their lives is stable, dependable, and immune to the kind of darkness that belongs only to distant headlines. And yet, when night begins to settle over those same streets, when the sounds begin to fade and the spaces between moments grow longer and quieter, there is often a shift so subtle that it goes unnoticed. A shift that allows something far more deliberate, far more patient, to move undetected through the very places that feel the safest. It was within such a city, one that had never before been defined by violence or fear, that a pattern began to emerge in the latter half of 2024. A pattern that did not announce itself through chaos or brutality, but instead revealed itself through absence, through stillness, through a series of deaths that, at first glance, appeared so peaceful that they were almost overlooked. The first victim was discovered by her sister on an otherwise unremarkable morning, when repeated phone calls had gone unanswered and concern, mild at first, had gradually evolved into something more urgent, something that compelled her to visit the apartment unannounced. And when she entered, using a spare key that had never before been needed in such a context, she found her sister lying in bed exactly as she might have been expected to lie after a long night's sleep. Her body positioned comfortably, her face relaxed, and her surroundings undisturbed in a way that suggested nothing out of the ordinary had taken place. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of struggle, no indication that anyone else had been present in the apartment, and for a brief moment, it seemed entirely possible that what had occurred was natural, an unfortunate but not uncommon event, the quiet passing of a life without warning or spectacle. It was only when the medical examiner conducted a more thorough analysis that the first fracture in that assumption began to appear. Not as something obvious or dramatic, but as a subtle inconsistency, a detail that did not align with the expected conclusions. And that detail was found within the lungs, where the evidence suggested not the presence of disease or trauma, but the unmistakable signs of oxygen deprivation, a condition that could not be easily explained by the circumstances in which the body had been found. Even then, the conclusion remained uncertain, because there was no clear mechanism by which such deprivation could have occurred, no obstruction, no environmental factor, no visible cause that could be identified or confirmed, and so the case was recorded as inconclusive, a quiet anomaly that might have remained just that, had it not been for what followed. Because within weeks, a second case emerged, and then a third, each one bearing the same eerie resemblance to the first, each one unfolding in the same manner, within the same boundaries of normalcy, and yet each one carrying that same subtle indication that something had interfered with the most basic function of life. Something had interrupted the act of breathing in a way that left no trace beyond its absence. It was at this point that Detective Laura Bennett became involved, not because the cases had yet been officially connected, but because there was something about the repetition, something about the precision with which these deaths occurred, that suggested intention rather than coincidence. And Laura, who had spent years navigating the complexities of criminal behavior, had learned to recognize the patterns that others might overlook, especially when those patterns were defined not by what was present, but by what was missing. She began by examining the victims, not only their medical reports, but their lives, their routines, their habits, searching for any thread that might link them together. And what she found was not immediately obvious, because the victims appeared on the surface to have nothing in common, no shared workplace, no overlapping social circles, no direct connection that could explain why they, out of countless others, had been chosen. But when she shifted her focus, when she moved beyond the obvious and began to consider the intangible aspects of their lives, a different pattern began to emerge, one that was defined not by who they were, but by how they lived. Because each victim, without exception, had been alone at the time of death. Each had lived in a space that was isolated enough to allow for privacy. and each had maintained a routine that could be observed, predicted, and ultimately exploited. The realization did not come all at once, but rather in fragments, pieces of information that aligned gradually until they formed a picture that was both coherent and deeply disturbing. A picture that suggested the presence of an individual who did not rely on force or confrontation, but instead on patience, observation, and an understanding of human vulnerability that went far beyond what could be considered ordinary. There was no sign of entry because entry had not been forced. There was no struggle because the victims had not been given the opportunity to resist. There was no evidence because the method itself left nothing behind. It was not until a fourth victim was discovered that the investigation took a decisive turn, because this time there was something different, something that had been overlooked by the perpetrator, perhaps unintentionally, perhaps as a result of overconfidence, but significant enough to alter the course of the case. A security camera, positioned across the street from the victim's residence, captured a figure entering the building late at night. A figure whose presence could not be immediately explained, and though the footage was limited, though the image lacked clarity, it provided something that had been absent until that moment. A point of reference, a starting place. The figure was tall, composed, and deliberate in his movements, entering and exiting with a calmness that suggested familiarity rather than intrusion. And it was this detail, more than any other, that led Laura to consider the possibility that the perpetrator was not an outsider, not someone forcing his way into unfamiliar spaces, but someone who belonged, someone who could move within these environments without drawing attention. The investigation expanded, drawing in additional resources, examining building access records, reviewing maintenance logs, and it was through this process that a name surfaced. Evan Cole, a contracted technician, someone who had worked across multiple residential buildings in the area, performing routine maintenance, inspections, and repairs. Someone who had legitimate access to private spaces, someone who could enter without suspicion, and most importantly, someone who had been present, in one capacity or another, in each of the locations where the victims had lived. When Evan was brought in for questioning, he presented himself with a composure that was almost disarming, answering questions with clarity, maintaining eye contact, and offering explanations that, on the surface, appeared entirely reasonable. And yet, beneath that composure, there was something else, something that Laura could not immediately define, but could not ignore. It was not what he said, it was how he said it. The absence of hesitation, the absence of uncertainty, the absence of anything that might suggest discomfort. It was, in a word, controlled. Too controlled. As the investigation deepened, as forensic evidence was re-examined and timelines were reconstructed, the case against Evan began to solidify, not through a single piece of definitive proof, but through a convergence of details that, when taken together, left little room for doubt. And when the evidence was finally presented to him, when the narrative of his actions was laid out in a way that could no longer be dismissed or deflected, something shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly, but enough. Because in that moment, the control that had defined him began to fracture, revealing beneath the surface a perspective that was as chilling as it was revealing. He did not describe his actions as violent. He did not describe them as wrong. Instead, he spoke of them as necessary, as deliberate interruptions in what he referred to as the illusion of permanence, explaining in a tone that remained disturbingly calm that breathing, the act that sustains life, is something so automatic, so unexamined, that people forget how fragile it truly is, and that his actions were, in his view, a way of restoring awareness, of forcing a moment of recognition in the final seconds before that act was taken away. He described the process not as an attack, but as an observation, as a study, as a moment of stillness. The stillness between breaths, he called it, a phrase that would later become synonymous with the case itself. Evan Cole was arrested, charged, and eventually convicted, bringing an official end to the investigation. But for those who had been affected, for the families, for the community, and for Detective Laura Bennett, the resolution did not bring the sense of closure that might have been expected. Because the nature of the case, the method, the mindset, and the quiet precision with which it had been carried out, left behind a lingering unease, a realization that the most dangerous individuals are not always the ones who act with visible aggression, but the ones who move silently, who observe patiently, and who understand the vulnerabilities that others need. And even now, long after the case has been closed, long after the headlines have faded and the city has returned to its routines, there remains a subtle shift in the way people move through their lives, a quiet awareness that something so simple, so fundamental, can be interrupted without warning. Because sometimes the most terrifying thing is not the presence of danger, but the absence of something we have always taken for granted. And sometimes it is only in the stillness, between breaths, that we begin to understand how fragile everything truly is.